The story of America's discovery is one of the most celebrated tales in the history of Western civilization. Children grow up hearing of Christopher Columbus, the daring navigator who crossed the unknown Atlantic Ocean in 1492 and revealed a new world to Europe. His ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, have become icons of human courage and exploration, symbols of the age of discovery. The narrative is clean, heroic, and simple. Columbus was the first to set foot on the shores of a new continent, forever changing the course of history. But as with so many stories written into our collective memory, the truth may be far more complex, and perhaps far stranger than we dare to imagine. Behind the triumphal image of Columbus lies a deeper question that refuses to be silenced. Was he really the first outsider to reach the Americas? Long before his sails appeared on the horizon of the Caribbean, whispers had spread in the old world of lands that lay far to the west, across the great ocean. Tales of strange people, of abundant resources, of shores lined with forests and rivers, circulated among sailors and storytellers for centuries. What if Columbus's arrival was not a first encounter, but merely the final act in a drama that had been playing out for millennia, with cast members now erased from the official record? Mainstream history tends to close the book before such questions can even be asked. To challenge the narrative of Columbus as the sole discoverer of America is to step outside the boundaries of accepted scholarship. And yet, scattered across the globe, pieces of a puzzle seem to glimmer faintly. Old maps depicting coastlines centuries ahead of their time, inscriptions in languages no one can explain, legends of foreign strangers who came from the sea, and the haunting possibility that civilizations we thought were bound to the Mediterranean or the Nile may have once looked westward, daring to cross the expanse of the Atlantic. This mystery gains strength when we realize just how deeply humans have always hungered to explore. From the first time our ancestors lashed logs together into rafts, they set sail not only along rivers, but out onto the dangerous seas. To imagine that the great civilizations of the ancient world, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Norse, or even the Malians of West Africa, would never have attempted to follow the ocean's currents westward seems almost contrary to human nature itself. The Atlantic, with its rhythms of wind and tide, has always been less of a barrier than a bridge. It carries anything caught in its embrace across, often with surprising speed. Could it really be that no one before Columbus allowed themselves to be carried by it, whether by accident or by design? For centuries, these questions have been silenced, reduced to curious footnotes in the margins of history books. But in recent years, a new light has begun to shine on the evidence, drawing connections between old artifacts and overlooked testimonies. The result is a picture of pre-Columbian America that is less isolated, more mysterious, and potentially more connected to the ancient world than we were ever taught to believe. And if this picture proves even partly true, it reshapes everything we think we know about history. Not just the history of the Americas, but of humanity itself. Imagine, for a moment, that the story is true. Imagine Carthaginian ships setting sail from North Africa, their sails catching the trade winds that push them westward. Imagine Norse longships, their hulls slicing through icy waters, stumbling upon unfamiliar shores rich with vines and rivers. Imagine African canoes carried on powerful currents to Brazil, or Irish monks seeking solitude in far-off lands, only to find that they were not alone. If such voyages happened, they were more than accidents. They were encounters, exchanges, and moments of contact that left ripples in myth, language, and even DNA. What was lost to history might remain preserved in the bones of ancient people, in the carvings on stone, or in the whispered memories of indigenous traditions that speak of gods who came from across the sea. But here lies the tension at the heart of this mystery. If so many fragments of evidence exist, why has the world remained so attached to the Columbus story? Perhaps the answer lies in power. The tale of Columbus is not only about discovery. It is about conquest. To admit that others came before him would disrupt the neat foundation of European colonization, challenging the very idea of the Americas as a new world. To acknowledge older contacts would mean acknowledging that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were not isolated primitives awaiting discovery, but active participants in a global web of connections long before Columbus claimed the land for Spain. Such a revelation undermines the myth of European superiority that justified centuries of empire. The erasure of pre-Columbian voyagers, then, may not be a mere accident of history. It may have been deliberate, the quiet burying of evidence that contradicted the story powerful nations needed to tell about themselves. And so, these forgotten voyagers remain hidden, their tales buried under layers of silence, waiting for someone to uncover them again. As we begin this journey, we step into a twilight zone of history where evidence and speculation mingle, where mainstream certainty collides with ancient memory. We will travel across oceans of time, tracing the footsteps of Norsemen, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Celts, Africans, and Asians, each said to have touched the shores of the Americas before Columbus. We will explore artifacts deemed fraudulent by some, sacred by others. We will hear the voices of indigenous legends describing pale-skinned strangers, and we will confront the question, are these simply myths or preserved memories of real encounters? The deeper we go, the more we find ourselves at the edge of a grander mystery. For if even one of these stories is true, then the history of America is not the story of a land discovered in 1492, but the story of a land already known, visited, and perhaps even mapped long before Europe's so-called Age of Discovery. It becomes not the tale of one man's daring journey, but of countless forgotten voyages that linked the hemispheres in ways we are only beginning to understand. And so, the curtain rises on a forgotten chapter of human history, a chapter in which Columbus is not the lone hero, but merely one among many voyagers, each leaving behind faint traces of their passage. Some traces remain visible, others lie buried beneath the soil, dismissed by archaeologists, or kept in dusty museum drawers labeled unverified. To pursue this chapter is to embark on a voyage of our own, one that sails not across the Atlantic, but across the turbulent sea of history itself. Our compass will not be certainty, but curiosity. Our guiding star will be the possibility that the world is larger, stranger, and far more interconnected than we were taught to believe. Columbus's voyage may have changed the world, but it was not the beginning. It was a continuation, the final wave in a tide of forgotten journeys. The real story of America's discovery does not begin in 1492. It begins in shadows, in myths, and in the daring hearts of ancient voyagers who crossed into the unknown centuries, perhaps millennia, before Columbus ever set sail. Long before the sails of Columbus cut across the Atlantic horizon, the people of the Americas already carried memories of strangers who had come from the sea. These memories were not recorded in European books, nor carved into the pages of official history, but whispered in the stories of elders, painted in the colors of myth, and preserved in oral traditions that stretched back through centuries. To many modern scholars, these stories are dismissed as allegory, spiritual metaphor, or pure invention. Yet when heard closely, their details contain echoes of something that feels less like imagination and more like memory. Among the Maya and Aztec, there were tales of gods who arrived from the east, tall, pale, and bearded, unlike the native peoples themselves. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is one such figure. He is described as a bringer of knowledge, a civilizer who came across the sea and promised one day to return. In the high Andes, the Incas told of Viracocha, a great teacher who emerged from the waters, spreading wisdom before vanishing once more across the ocean. Though the gods may be cloaked in the garments of myth, one cannot help but wonder, were they divine beings, or simply the half-remembered memory of foreign voyagers who came from faraway shores? Even among North American tribes, echoes of these encounters remain. Some legends speak of pale strangers with long beards, arriving in canoes unlike any seen before. Others describe men who brought strange tools, knowledge of metals, or seeds foreign to the soil of the continent. The Algonquin peoples carried stories of white-faced visitors who traded goods and then vanished. Far to the south, tribes of the Amazon spoke of gods who brought fire and iron. Again and again, across vast distances and unrelated cultures, the same pattern arises. Strangers from beyond the horizon, often associated with wisdom, sometimes with conquest, always leaving a mark on memory. For generations, anthropologists have insisted that such tales are simply cultural metaphors, expressions of cosmic cycles or archetypal myths. And yet, some details seem stubbornly resistant to symbolic interpretation. The beards, for instance. Why would so many peoples, for whom facial hair was rare or absent, repeatedly describe visitors with great beards unless such people had indeed appeared? Why would civilizations separated by thousands of miles independently tell of gods or strangers arriving from across the sea, unless such arrivals had at least once happened? It is here, in the fragile boundary between history and legend, that the truth may dwell. Oral traditions, after all, are more than stories. They are archives. They preserve events across centuries when no written records exist. Time and memory alter them, yes, wrapping history in the garments of poetry and myth, but within them lies a core of truth that can survive astonishing spans of time. Just as Homer's Iliad, once thought to be pure myth, led archaeologists to the ruins of Troy, perhaps the myths of the Americas contain within them the memory of ancient voyagers who crossed the seas. These legends gain even greater weight when paired with other fragments of evidence. The Inca spoke of Viracocha as a man who wore a long robe and carried a staff. In parts of Central America, the descriptions of Quetzalcoatl depict him not only as bearded, but as arriving in boats of serpent-like design. Along the Mississippi, among the mound builders, there are tales of shining visitors who came from the sunrise. Each of these details could be dismissed in isolation, but together they create a web of suggestion, pointing to the possibility that these are not inventions, but recollections of contact. The indigenous peoples themselves, in many cases, believed their ancestors had interacted with outsiders. When Europeans first arrived in the 16th century, they were often met not with confusion, but with a strange recognition. The Aztecs famously associated Hernán Cortés with the returning Quetzalcoatl. To the Spaniards, this was convenient superstition. To us, it is a haunting clue. Why would such a myth exist in the first place, if not rooted in some distant memory of earlier strangers from the East? In the world of archaeology, such oral histories are often treated as problematic, too mutable, too subjective to be trusted. And yet, indigenous traditions have again and again guided researchers to real discoveries. Ruins, artifacts, and forgotten sites buried for centuries. If they can preserve the memory of sacred places with accuracy, is it truly so impossible that they might also preserve memories of encounters with voyagers long before Columbus? Of course, there is danger in taking legends too literally. Myths have a way of weaving together truth and symbol, of magnifying ordinary events into divine drama. A single shipwreck, a handful of foreign traders, could become, in memory, the story of gods who came from across the sea. Yet even if the scale is exaggerated, the seed of contact may still be there. The myths may not record great migrations or conquests, but fleeting encounters, moments of wonder that lodged so deeply in memory that they became mythologized across centuries. And so we are left with a tantalizing tension. Either these stories are coincidence, arising independently in cultures across a vast continent, or they are fragments of history, distorted, yes, but carrying echoes of encounters long forgotten by written history. If the latter is true, then indigenous myths are not just folklore, but testimony, the last surviving voices of a global history that official accounts have chosen to silence. The very persistence of these myths suggests they mattered. They were carried across generations, repeated by firelight, woven into ceremonies, remembered with reverence. They mattered because they preserved the story of meetings between worlds, meetings that altered identities, shifted cosmologies, and reshaped how people saw themselves in relation to the wider universe. For the people of the Americas, the strangers who came from the sea were not trivial. They were transformative, and transformations, once experienced, are never forgotten. As we journey deeper into this hidden history, these legends will serve as guideposts. They are not proof in the archaeological sense, but they're the whispers of memory. And when whispers are repeated across vast lands, when they echo in the stories of different peoples, they suggest that behind them lies something real. Perhaps a fleet of Norsemen glimpsed by Algonquin hunters. Perhaps African sailors carried by the currents to Brazil, remembered in the myths of gods from the sunrise. Perhaps Phoenician traders shipwrecked in the Caribbean, leaving behind fragments of their language in myths of serpent gods. Each possibility lingers within the legends, waiting to be explored. The textbooks will tell us that Columbus discovered America. But the legends of America's first peoples hint at another truth, that long before his sails appeared, others had already crossed the oceans, leaving their shadows on the memories of those who lived here. The gods of myth may not have been gods at all, but voyagers, forgotten travelers whose stories survive not in books, but in the living memory of the people they met. If there is one pre-Columbian voyage that mainstream history reluctantly acknowledges, it is that of the Norsemen. Their story has always stood half in legend, half in fact, caught between the sagas of Iceland and the soil of North America. While Columbus's voyages were backed by royal charters and chronicled in official records, the Norse story comes to us in fragments, in weathered sagas whispered by skalds, in ruins buried under grass, in scattered artifacts that refuse to fit neatly into the narrative. Yet together, these fragments weave a haunting tale of Vinland, the land of wine, that may have been North America itself. The tale begins in the late 10th century, when the restless spirit of the Vikings had already carried them far across the northern seas. From their homelands in Norway and Denmark, they had carved settlements in Iceland, conquered parts of Ireland, raided the coasts of France, and even reached the cold shores of Greenland. It was from this edge-of-the-world colony that Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, heard stories of lands farther west. According to the sagas, a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, blown off course, had glimpsed wooded shores unknown to the Norse. Where Bjarni only gazed from a distance, Leif set out to explore. In the saga of the Greenlanders, Leif sails westward and discovers lands unlike the icy barrens of Greenland. First, he comes to a rocky, barren place he names Helioland, the land of flat stones, likely modern-day Baffin Island. Then to a forested coast, which he calls Markland, the land of woods, perhaps Labrador. Finally, farther south, he finds a rich and temperate land where grapes grow wild and wheat springs naturally from the ground. He names it Vinland. For centuries, scholars debated whether Vinland was real or a poetic invention. But in 1960, two archaeologists, Helga and Ingstad, uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. The discovery shook history. Here, at the northern tip of Newfoundland, lay the unmistakable ruins of Norse longhouses, thick-walled turf structures with stone hearths, unmistakably Scandinavian in design. The site proved beyond doubt that the Norse had crossed the Atlantic 5 centuries before Columbus. The sagas, once dismissed as myths, suddenly had flesh and bone. Yet the ruins also pose questions. The site seemed too small, too temporary, to match the thriving Vinland of the sagas. No vineyards grow in Newfoundland, nor does wheat spring naturally from the soil. Was Lance aux Meadows only a base camp, a northern outpost for journeys farther south? Some scholars believe the Norse pressed deeper into North America, reaching as far as New England or even beyond. If so, then Vinland may not have been Newfoundland at all, but the warmer, fertile lands farther down the coast. Evidence for such deeper exploration lies scattered like breadcrumbs across the continent. Norse-style artifacts have been claimed in places far from Newfoundland. A coin in Maine, a spindle whorl in Labrador, possible runic inscriptions on rocks in Minnesota and Oklahoma. Each discovery is controversial, often dismissed as forgeries or misinterpretations. Yet the sheer spread of such claims fuels a tantalizing possibility. Perhaps the Norse ventured farther than we know, leaving only faint traces behind. The sagas themselves support this idea. They describe encounters with indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called the Skraelings. These were not brief meetings but interactions, sometimes peaceful, often violent. The sagas recount trading furs, weapons, and milk with the Skraelings, but also bloody clashes in which Norsemen were driven back to their ships. If such stories are true, they mark some of the first meetings between Europe and the Americas. What memories of these encounters might survive, not only in Norse saga, but in indigenous legend? Could some of the stories of pale-skinned strangers, preserved in native traditions, be memories of Viking visitors? The mystery deepens when we consider the Norse talent for navigation. They were among the finest sailors of the medieval world, their longships capable of carrying them across vast distances with astonishing speed. They used the sun, stars, and possibly even lodestones to chart their way. For men who had already reached Iceland, Greenland, and even glimpsed the edge of North America, it is hardly unthinkable that they might have sailed farther, mapping stretches of the coastline unknown to Europeans for centuries. And yet, for all their daring, the Norse presence in America seems to have vanished like smoke. The settlements did not last. The sagas tell of hardship, of hostility from the Skraelings, of journeys too long and dangerous to sustain. The Greenland colonies themselves eventually withered, cut off by climate change and shifting trade routes. Vinland faded into legend, preserved only in story until its faint remains were unearthed centuries later. Still, one cannot escape the feeling that the Norse left a greater mark than we know. Did their voyages inspire later maps, the mysterious medieval charts that seemed to show the American coastline before Columbus? Did they carry tales back to Europe of lands across the ocean, tales that filtered through generations until reaching the ears of men like Columbus? Some suggest Columbus himself may have known the sagas, or at least rumors of Vinland, and that they shaped his conviction that lands lay waiting to the west. If so, then even though the Norse settlements failed, their shadow lingered, nudging history toward its fateful course. What remains most haunting is the silence. The sagas describe lands rich with resources, rivers teeming with salmon, forests thick with timber, lands far more abundant than Greenland. Yet these opportunities were abandoned, left untouched for centuries until Columbus arrived. Why? Perhaps the Norse lacked the numbers, the support, the political will to colonize. Perhaps the resistance of the indigenous peoples was too strong. Or perhaps history is not always shaped by what is possible, but by what is chosen. Today, when one stands at Lance aux Meadows, among the grassy mounds that once sheltered Viking explorers, the wind carries a ghostly weight. It is the silence of a story half told. The sagas whisper of journeys deeper into the continent, of battles, of discoveries, but the land itself holds few answers. It is as if the Norse presence in America exists in a twilight realm, caught between proof and possibility, confirmed yet incomplete. What is certain is this: long before Columbus, European sails touched the shores of America. The Norse knew of it, named it, lived upon it. Their presence is a crack in the neat narrative of history, a reminder that the world has always been more connected than we are told. And if one such voyage was real, might there not have been others? If the Norse could cross, who else might have sailed into those same waters, leaving their traces not in stone houses, but in the myths and memories of the people they met? The story of the Norse in America does not end with their disappearance. Instead, it opens the door to a larger mystery, the possibility that Vinland was only one chapter in a longer saga of forgotten voyages, a saga that stretches across oceans and centuries, linking distant civilizations in ways history has long denied. If the Norse voyages are the most widely accepted story of pre-Columbian contact, the case of the Phoenicians and their Carthaginian heirs belongs to a deeper, stranger realm of history. The Phoenicians were the supreme mariners of the ancient Mediterranean, masters of shipbuilding, navigation, and trade. From their city-states along the coast of present-day Lebanon, they ventured far and wide, spreading their alphabet, their purple dye, and their influence. Later, their descendants in Carthage extended that maritime empire even further, across the western Mediterranean, down the coast of Africa, and into the pages of Rome's darkest fears. For centuries, whispers have suggested that these sailors may have crossed not just the familiar seas of Europe and Africa, but the vast expanse of the Atlantic itself. The possibility seems less impossible when one considers their abilities. The Phoenicians were not mere coastal traders. They built ships sturdy enough to cross open seas, capable of carrying large crews and heavy cargoes. Their navigation relied on the stars, the winds, and an intimate knowledge of currents. Ancient historians themselves hint at voyages that stretched far beyond the Straits of Gibraltar into what was then called the Sea of Darkness. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, claimed that Phoenician sailors commissioned by an Egyptian pharaoh circumnavigated Africa, an astonishing feat confirmed only millennia later. If they could circle Africa, was it so unthinkable that they could have crossed the Atlantic as well? The Carthaginians, inheritors of Phoenician seafaring genius, guarded their maritime knowledge with zeal. Roman sources tell us they deliberately kept their oceanic route secret, even sinking their own ships to prevent rivals from discovering their courses. The Carthaginian navigator Hanno the Explorer is said to have sailed down the West African coast as early as the 5th century BC, establishing colonies and encountering strange peoples and animals. His journey is preserved in the Periplus of Hanno, an ancient text that reads like a fragment of a lost epic. Some believe his voyage may have carried him much farther than Africa, perhaps even across the Atlantic, borne westward by the same currents that today sweep ships directly from Africa to the Americas. Clues that support this possibility are scattered, fragile, and often dismissed. Coins of Carthaginian origin have allegedly been found in the Americas, from Connecticut to Venezuela. Some dismiss them as modern hoaxes, lost collectors' items, or mere curiosities washed ashore. Yet the sheer number of such claims makes one pause. Could even a handful be genuine, left behind by sailors blown far from their intended course? Carthaginian coins often bore the image of a horse, a palm tree, or the goddess Tanit, symbols strangely resonant with some New World imagery, though perhaps this is coincidence. More puzzling are inscriptions and carvings found on stones across the Americas that some claim resemble Phoenician or Carthaginian script. In Brazil, inscriptions at Pedra de Gavia near Rio de Janeiro have been interpreted by some as Phoenician letters naming a king of Tyre. Those scholars reject the reading as fanciful. In New Mexico and elsewhere, markings on stone have stirred similar debate. Mainstream archaeology insists these are natural formations or later carvings, but believers argue they are faint echoes of ancient voyagers leaving their marks on distant lands. Perhaps the most tantalizing suggestion comes not from artifacts, but from plants. How did crops like maize appear in parts of Africa long before Columbus? How did certain plants of American origin show up in the Old World centuries before official contact? Some argue that Phoenician or Carthaginian trade may be the answer, carrying seeds across the ocean in the holds of their ships. The idea is intoxicating. Imagine a Carthaginian quinquereme, sails taut with wind, swept westward across the Atlantic. Imagine its crew, hardened by war and trade, glimpsing unknown shores, dense forests, and rivers wider than any they had seen. Would they have returned home to tell of it, or would they have vanished in a legend, lost to storms, hostile encounters, or the silence of distance? One reason such voyages, if they occurred, remain hidden may be deliberate suppression. Rome, after all, did everything it could to erase Carthage from memory. After the Punic Wars, Carthage was razed, its libraries destroyed, its knowledge scattered or lost. If records of Atlantic voyages existed, they may have perished in those flames, leaving behind only scattered hints. History, as always, is written by the victors, and the victors had no interest in preserving Carthaginian achievements. Yet the ocean itself remembers. The currents from West Africa flow unceasingly towards South America, a natural conveyor belt carrying any vessel across in weeks. Even a drifting ship, damaged or unmanned, could make the journey. 4 skilled sailors like the Carthaginians, armed with knowledge of wind and tide, such a crossing may have been not only possible, but inevitable. Skeptics dismiss these theories as fanciful, pointing to the lack of definitive artifacts, the absence of unambiguous inscriptions, the dangers of projecting connections where none exist. And yet, the skeptics cannot erase the allure of the question. For every dismissed coin, there is another that resists easy explanation. For every supposed inscription deemed fake, there is one whose patterns linger like a whisper of recognition. For every plant, every legend, every fragment, there is the haunting possibility that we are glimpsing the edges of a forgotten truth. What is certain is that the Phoenicians and Carthaginians were capable of the journey. The question is not whether they could have crossed the Atlantic, but whether they did. And if they did, what traces remain? Were they fleeting visitors, their voyages forgotten even in their own time, or were they more than that? Unacknowledged pioneers whose journeys to the New World were erased by the tides of conquest and the silence of history? The story of Carthaginian and Phoenician contact with America may never be proven to the satisfaction of conventional history. But as long as the ocean winds blow westward, as long as fragments of coins glimmer in the soil, as long as legends whisper of strangers arriving from the sea, the possibility will remain. And in that possibility lies a haunting truth, that the world was smaller, more connected, and far more mysterious than we have been taught to believe. Among the most provocative and controversial theories of pre-Columbian contact are those that suggest the Egyptians themselves may have crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus. To most, it seems almost impossible. A civilization bound to the Nile, rich in monumental architecture and intricate knowledge of astronomy, yet seemingly unaware of the lands across the ocean. And yet, when one examines the evidence closely, a pattern begins to emerge that hints at daring voyages, lost knowledge, and connections that mainstream history is reluctant to acknowledge. The Egyptians were masters of the river and the sea. Their ships, some depicted in tombs and reliefs, were capable of carrying both cargo and crews along the Nile and into the Red Sea. They understood wind, tide, and current with remarkable precision. Trade networks extended to Punt, the mysterious land to the south, and across the Mediterranean to Crete and beyond. If the Egyptians could sail across the Mediterranean, could they not attempt the greater challenge of the open Atlantic? Some scholars suggest that with knowledge of prevailing winds and ocean currents, a transatlantic voyage, though perilous, would have been within their grasp. The question gains urgency when we consider certain enigmatic artifacts and anomalies. In the early 20th century, reports emerged that traces of coca and tobacco, plants native only to the Americas, were found in Egyptian mummies dating back thousands of years. Skeptics dismiss the findings as contamination, yet the implications are staggering if true. Could these substances have been transported across oceans by adventurous voyagers? Could Egyptian sailors have touched South America long before Europe dreamed of it? Further intrigue comes from depictions in Egyptian art and the occasional artifact that some argue resembles New World iconography. Some hieroglyphs appear to depict plants or animals unknown in Africa or the Mediterranean, yet native to the Americas. While mainstream scholars tend to interpret these as symbolic or mistaken, alternative theorists suggest they may record first-hand observation of foreign lands. Could Egyptian explorers have cataloged flora, fauna, and distant shores, their knowledge encoded in the sacred carvings of temples and tombs? The evidence becomes more tantalizing when we examine the timing of Egypt's most adventurous periods. During the Old and Middle Kingdoms, pharaohs organized massive expeditions to Punt and beyond. It was an era when seafaring was not only a skill, but a statement of power and prestige. Rulers commissioned fleets capable of traversing great distances, bringing back exotic goods to display their reach and influence. In such a climate of ambition, could there have been individuals daring enough to push further, to follow currents westward into the unknown? Some researchers point to ancient myths and legends as additional clues. Egyptian mythology often speaks of distant lands across waters, places where gods journey and return with knowledge. Could these stories encode memories of real voyages, repeated over centuries and transformed into myth? Could the Egyptians themselves have believed that beyond the horizon lay lands of promise and danger, waiting to be discovered by the bold few who dare to sail beyond the known world? Skeptical voices remind us that proof remains elusive. There are no Egyptian settlements, no undeniable artifacts, no inscriptions unequivocally placing them in the Americas. And yet, in the shadows between certainty and speculation, the anomalies linger. Small statuettes, unusual carvings, and reports of mysterious mummies stir the imagination. They are fragments of a story that might have existed, erased over millennia by the sands of time and the limitations of preservation. One particularly fascinating line of inquiry involves botanical evidence. The presence of maize, potatoes, and other American crops in the Old World before Columbus remains contested but intriguing. Could early contact with transoceanic voyagers explain such anomalies? Even if these contacts were sporadic and undocumented, the possibility suggests that the ancient Egyptians may have glimpsed lands across the Atlantic, learned of new plants, and perhaps returned with their observations encoded in religious or ceremonial contexts. The idea of Egyptians on the Atlantic challenges our sense of history. The prevailing narrative paints them as a civilization confined to the Nile Valley, monumental yet provincial. But consider this. They built structures aligned with the stars, organized vast riverine expeditions, and transported obelisks weighing hundreds of tons with remarkable ingenuity. A people capable of such feats could scarcely be imagined. Incapable of crossing an ocean with careful planning, knowledge of currents, and determination. Some theorists even speculate about lost knowledge, ancient Egyptian understanding of navigation, geography, and astronomy that has not survived in our modern records. Could it be that certain techniques, perhaps too sacred or practical for general record, enabled daring voyages westward? The thought is intoxicating. Fleets of Egyptian ships, carved with sacred symbols, guided by the stars, making their way to lands beyond the horizon, their crews recording observations that would vanish with the passage of time. And what are the cultural echoes that might suggest contact? Mesoamerican pyramids, sun cults, and ritual practices bear faint resemblance to Egyptian forms. While such comparisons are highly speculative and controversial, the similarities provoke thought. Could they reflect independent development, or might they be faint traces of knowledge carried across oceans, transmitted by voyagers who sailed before recorded history took shape in Europe? If the Egyptians did reach the Americas, the consequences are profound. It suggests a history of human endeavor far more interconnected than textbooks acknowledge. It implies that knowledge, technology, and culture may have flowed across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. It raises the tantalizing possibility that the Old World and the New were not entirely separate, but linked by daring voyagers whose stories were buried, distorted, or transformed into myth. Yet, perhaps the most compelling aspect of this theory lies not in proof, but in possibility. History often remembers the loud, documented, and official achievements, while countless voyages, discoveries, and encounters vanish into obscurity. The Egyptians, with their obsession for monumental record-keeping, may have had their own reasons for keeping certain voyages secret, ritual, power, or prestige. And even if they did not leave physical evidence, the ocean currents themselves remember, carrying whispers of distant adventures from one shore to another. Ultimately, the notion of Egyptian voyagers in the Americas asks us to reimagine history. It challenges the boundaries of what is possible, compelling us to consider the ingenuity, daring, and curiosity of civilization often dismissed as bound to its river. It invites us to ponder a world in which the Atlantic was not an insurmountable barrier, but a passageway, a conduit of human ambition and exploration. And in doing so, it sets the stage for a larger question that threads through all pre-Columbian voyages. How many stories of discovery, courage, and daring have been lost to time, waiting for those willing to look beyond the horizon? In the end, the Egyptians remind us that history is not merely what is written in texts or preserved in ruins. It is what can be glimpsed in the shadows, inferred from fragments, and imagined from the courage of those who dared to cross into the unknown. The possibility of their voyages to the Americas, whether fully realized or forever speculative, cast a shadow over the tidy story of Columbus. It whispers that the story of human exploration is far older, far stranger, and far more interconnected than we have ever been taught to believe. Long before Columbus set sail, whispers of transatlantic voyages echoed from the misty isles of the north. Among these are the stories of Celtic mariners, seafarers whose ambition and courage rivaled the Norse. The Celts of Ireland and Wales were not only warriors and poets, but also explorers who looked beyond the horizon with restless curiosity. Their legends are filled with journeys across stormy seas, islands lost to memory, and lands described with a clarity that makes the imagination stir. One of the most famous of these is the legend of Saint Brendan, known as Brendan the Navigator, whose epic voyage across the Atlantic would inspire generations. According to the tale, Brendan, an Irish monk of the 6th century, left his monastery to seek the promised land of the saints. His journey carried him beyond the familiar coasts of Europe, into seas shrouded in fog and mystery. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, a text written centuries after his time, describes islands floating in the ocean, immense birds, and a land rich in abundance, lush with forests and fertile soil. Some interpretations suggest that Brendan may have glimpsed parts of North America, possibly Newfoundland or even further south, though the story blurs fact and legend. Yet the consistency of the description across versions hints at a memory rooted in real experience, preserved in the language of myth. The tale of Brendan is not an isolated story. Legends of Prince Madoc, a Welsh prince said to have sailed west in the 12th century to escape civil war at home, claim that he and his followers reached distant shores in the Americas. These accounts describe settlements, interactions with indigenous peoples, and even the establishment of colonies that endured for a time. While mainstream historians often regard these stories as fanciful, their endurance over centuries and the occasional tantalizing piece of circumstantial evidence make them difficult to dismiss entirely. The Celts were renowned for their navigation skills. Unlike the Mediterranean civilizations whose voyages hugged coastlines, the Celts ventured into open seas, guided by the stars, the winds, and their intimate knowledge of currents. They crafted sturdy ships capable of withstanding storms, designed for both speed and cargo. In an age before maps became widespread, they relied on oral knowledge, celestial navigation, and keen observation. These skills, combined with the currents of the North Atlantic, make it plausible that daring Celtic explorers could have crossed vast distances, perhaps arriving on the eastern shores of the Americas long before Columbus. Evidence for such contact, however, is scarce and controversial. Some point to anomalous inscriptions and artifacts discovered in parts of North America, suggesting Old World influence. Others cite tales of Welsh-speaking Native Americans encountered by European settlers centuries later. While these claims are debated and often dismissed, they remain a provocative hint that Celtic voyagers may have left their mark. If true, these encounters would predate Columbus by centuries, placing the Celts among the earliest known Europeans to reach the New World. The Celtic voyages, like those of the Norse, are intertwined with myth and spirituality. Brendan's journey was framed as a pilgrimage, a spiritual quest, while Madoc's voyage carried undertones of exile, survival, and colonization. Yet beneath the myth lies a practical story of human curiosity and the drive to explore unknown lands. These were not merely fanciful tales told to entertain. They were narratives that preserved knowledge, encoded in legend to survive the passage of centuries. It is worth considering the context of these voyages. The 6th and 12th centuries were times of great upheaval in Europe. Ireland, Wales, and Scotland experienced political strife, overpopulation, and famine. For ambitious explorers, the open sea offered both opportunity and escape. The Atlantic was dangerous, yes, but it also promised lands untouched, resources abundant, and the chance to carve out new beginnings. Could it be that some of these voyagers succeeded, if only briefly, and left traces in myths, oral histories, and perhaps even in the genetic or cultural memory of the peoples they encountered? Some evidence comes in the form of material culture. Early settlers in parts of Appalachia reported architectural techniques, symbols, and even musical instruments that bore a striking resemblance to Celtic forms. While not definitive, these observations suggest that contact, however brief or limited, may have left subtle marks. Other scholars note that the Atlantic currents from the British Isles naturally facilitate westward drift, making accidental or intentional landfall in North America a plausible scenario. A small fleet could have been carried across, arriving in unfamiliar lands, shaping legends in ways that would endure long after the voyagers themselves had vanished. The enduring allure of Celtic voyagers lies in their blending of courage and mystery. Unlike the Norse, whose raids and settlements left visible traces, the Celts seem to have moved silently across the ocean. Their presence felt more in stories than in ruins. This quiet passage allows the imagination to fill in gaps, to envision ships cutting through fog-laden waters, sails taut with wind, carrying monks, princes, or ordinary sailors into unknown lands. Their stories remind us that exploration is not always recorded in stone or ink, but in the collective memory of cultures and legends passed by word of mouth. And yet, the Celts' voyages also underscore a recurring theme in the history of pre-Columbian exploration: the tension between possibility and proof. How many other stories lie buried beneath centuries of skepticism, waiting for rediscovery? The narratives of Brendan and Maddox suggest that Europe's engagement with the Americas was far more complex than the simple tale of Columbus suggests. They hint at a world in which multiple peoples, driven by different motives and different skills, may have ventured west, encountering lands, peoples, and mysteries long before 1492. Ultimately, the story of Celtic voyagers is a story of courage and imagination. It is a reminder that the Atlantic was not an impassable barrier, but a challenge to be met by those willing to navigate the unknown. It encourages us to look beyond the familiar and question the neat boundaries of history. The myths preserve not only the memory of potential contact, but the essence of human curiosity, a force as powerful as any ocean current, capable of propelling people across the vast distances of the world, leaving stories that endure long after their footsteps vanish from the shore. As we contemplate these tales, we begin to see a pattern emerging. The Atlantic was crossed not just once, not just by one civilization, but repeatedly by daring explorers, each leaving faint traces in the memories, legends, and artifacts they left behind. The Celts, with their whispered journeys and mystical accounts, are part of this hidden history, a reminder that the story of America's discovery is far richer, far stranger, and far more interconnected than the textbooks ever reveal. While tales of Norse and Celtic voyages capture the imagination, one of the most compelling and often overlooked threads in the story of pre-Columbian contact comes from West Africa. Long before Columbus, the peoples of the Mali Empire and other West African civilizations were masters of trade, navigation, and exploration. The desert caravans that carried gold and salt across the Sahara were mirrored by fleets of riverine and coastal vessels, capable of carrying goods, ideas, and possibly people across the Atlantic. Among the most intriguing figures is Musa Musa's predecessor, Abu Bakr II, a ruler whose curiosity may have led him to attempt the ultimate voyage, a deliberate crossing of the Atlantic. Abu Bakr II ruled the Mali Empire in the early 14th century, a time of immense wealth and sophistication in West Africa. Accounts from Arab chroniclers describe a ruler obsessed with exploration, a man who sought to understand the limits of the known world. According to the 14th century historian Al-Mari, Abu Bakr II abdicated his throne to embark on an ambitious expedition across the Atlantic, outfitting a fleet of ships and sending hundreds of men into the unknown. What became of these vessels remains a mystery. Some historians believe the expedition vanished without a trace. Others suggest that survivors may have reached the Americas, establishing fleeting contact with indigenous peoples. The Atlantic currents make such a journey plausible. The Canary Current and the North Equatorial Current flow westward, naturally guiding vessels from West Africa to the Caribbean and northern South America. For sailors who understood these waters, the ocean itself could serve as both guide and highway. While European ships of the 15th century struggled with navigation, the West Africans possessed centuries of seafaring experience, sophisticated riverine technology, and an intimate knowledge of the winds and currents along the African coast. Crossing the Atlantic may not have been easy, but it was not impossible. Evidence of potential contact, though indirect, adds intrigue. Certain crops, such as the bottle gourd and possibly other plants, appear in the Americas prior to Columbus, suggesting some transoceanic transfer. Could they have arrived aboard West African vessels, carried westward by skilled navigators like Abu Bakr II and his crews? Other tantalizing hints come from cultural parallels, similarities in certain motifs, symbols, or craftsmanship that appear in West Africa and parts of the Americas. While skeptics argue coincidence, the patterns are curious enough to raise questions that mainstream history has largely ignored. One of the most fascinating aspects of Abu Bakr II's voyage is its ambition. Unlike accidental explorations or minor expeditions, this was a deliberate, state-sponsored attempt to cross an entire ocean. Al-Mari writes that hundreds of ships were launched, each carefully provisioned for the journey. The king himself is said to have boarded the lead vessel, determined to reach lands unknown. If these ships reached the Americas, even a fraction, they would represent the earliest recorded organized transatlantic expedition, an achievement that predates Columbus by more than a century. Of course, skepticism is natural. No physical settlements or definitive archaeological evidence of West African presence in the Americas has been universally accepted. Yet history often obscures deliberate voyages more effectively than accidental arrivals. If Abu Bakr II's fleet didn't encounter land, it may have been small-scale, temporary, or integrated into existing communities in ways that left few visible traces. Oral histories, indirect evidence, and tantalizing anomalies may be all that remain of a story too easily erased from the historical record. The possibility of African voyages reshapes our understanding of global exploration. It challenges the Eurocentric narrative that places Europe as the sole source of maritime innovation, highlighting instead a world in which multiple civilizations possess the ambition, skill, and knowledge to cross vast oceans. The Mali Empire was not a peripheral society. It was wealthy, sophisticated, and capable of mobilizing resources on a massive scale. The idea that its rulers might have directed oceanic voyages is not merely plausible. It is consistent with what we know of their ambition and ingenuity. Consider the implications. If Abu Bakr II or his captains reached the Americas, even fleetingly, they may have left impressions on indigenous societies, passed down through myth or memory. Some African influences, linguistic, cultural, or agricultural, may have persisted unnoticed for centuries. They would have been invisible to European observers who arrived later, but not necessarily absent from the historical fabric of the continent. This opens a window into a version of history where the Americas were not isolated prior to 1492, but part of a network of human contacts spanning continents and oceans. The story of West African voyagers also emphasizes the human drive to explore. Abu Bakr II did not venture into the Atlantic for conquest, glory, or wealth alone. He was driven by curiosity, ambition, and the desire to know the limits of the world. This mirrors the motivations of countless other ancient voyagers, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Norsemen, Celts, suggesting that the Atlantic was not a barrier, but a challenge that successive generations of explorers sought to meet. The voyages of West African mariners remind us that exploration is a universal impulse, not confined to one culture, continent, or era. Even in the absence of incontrovertible proof, the narrative of Abu Bakr II and his fleet adds depth and complexity to the story of pre-Columbian contact. It forces us to recognize that history is not linear, nor is it solely written by the victors of the age of exploration. Instead, it is a tapestry of ambition, courage, and human curiosity, woven from countless journeys that may have left only faint traces in memory, legend, or artifact. As we consider the possibility of African voyagers reaching the Americas, we begin to see a pattern emerging across centuries and civilizations. The Atlantic was crossed repeatedly by daring explorers from multiple regions, long before Columbus. The currents, the winds, the knowledge of the seas, and the indomitable human spirit all converge to make these voyages plausible. And while mainstream history focuses on the triumph of European discovery, the shadows of forgotten mariners linger, ghosts of journeys that reshaped the world in ways we may never fully know. In the story of pre-Columbian America, West African voyagers occupy a crucial chapter. They challenge our assumptions, expand our understanding of human achievement, and hint at a larger, interconnected world where knowledge and courage were not confined to a single continent. Abu Bakr II's fleet may have vanished into the Atlantic, but the very idea of their journey remains a testament to human ambition, a whisper across time that the oceans have always been navigable, and that the New World may have been glimpsed long before the sails of Columbus appeared on the horizon. While the Norse, Celts, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and West Africans offer compelling possibilities, another thread of pre-Columbian contact emerges from the East, Asia. Long before Columbus, the mariners of China, Japan, and Southeast Asia possessed ships, navigational knowledge, and ambition that could have carried them across the vast Pacific, reaching the shores of the Americas centuries ahead of European explorers. Unlike the Atlantic crossings, these journeys were more treacherous, involving the immense distances of the Pacific Ocean, yet records, maps, and tantalizing evidence suggest they may not have been impossible. Chinese maritime history offers particularly striking examples. By the early 15th century, during the Ming Dynasty, Chinese fleets commanded by the famed Admiral Zheng, he traversed the Indian Ocean in fleets of colossal junks. These ships were among the largest wooden vessels ever built, capable of carrying hundreds of men and tons of cargo. Though Zheng He's expeditions are well documented to reach as far as East Africa, some scholars speculate that Chinese explorers may have ventured even further, perhaps into the Pacific, guided by knowledge of currents, winds, and celestial navigation. The Pacific, though vast, was not impenetrable to skilled mariners. Some of the most intriguing evidence comes from the legends of indigenous peoples along the western coasts of the Americas. Among the native peoples of California, for example, there are stories of pale, Asian-like visitors who arrived in ships, bringing knowledge of agriculture, metalwork, and new foods. Along the coasts of Mexico and Central America, tales of tall, pale strangers with unusual garments and knowledge of distant lands echo the arrival of visitors from across the sea. While oral histories are not proof in the conventional sense, they often preserve kernels of truth that survive when written records are absent. Archaeological anomalies further spark speculation. Some artifacts in coastal Mexico and Peru resemble Asian tools or designs. Certain stone carvings, pottery techniques, and architectural forms bear resemblance to Asian counterparts, though mainstream scholars attribute these to coincidence or independent invention. The question persists: could these similarities reflect actual contact, rather than mere parallel development? For centuries, the idea seemed implausible, but if Chinese or other Asian mariners did reach the Americas, even fleetingly, such traces would be all that remained. The Pacific currents themselves offer tantalizing clues. The Kuroshio current flows from the east coast of Asia toward the west coast of North America, creating a natural passage that could have carried vessels westward. Drift voyages were not uncommon, and a skilled navigator could have used the winds, currents, and knowledge of monsoon patterns to make the journey intentionally. The ocean, while vast, does not act as an impenetrable barrier. It is a highway for those bold enough to master its rhythms. The Japanese also left hints of maritime exploration. Ancient Japanese texts speak of voyages beyond familiar waters, sometimes involving trade with distant lands. Though these accounts are often vague, the combination of advanced shipbuilding and navigational skill in East Asia makes the idea of Pacific crossings plausible. Even if such voyages were accidental or exploratory rather than systematic, the result would have been contact with distant peoples and lands. Some researchers point to botanical and cultural evidence. Crops such as sweet potatoes, native to South America, appear in Polynesia centuries before European contact. The distribution of these plants suggests that seeds traveled across thousands of miles of ocean, possibly carried by voyagers or drift. Could Asian sailors have inadvertently facilitated these transfers, planting the seeds of exchange long before Columbus arrived? The implications are extraordinary, suggesting a web of human interaction that spans oceans, cultures, and centuries. Historical texts add further intrigue. Certain maps from Asia depict lands far to the east, beyond the known coastlines of China and Japan. Some interpret these as speculative or mythical islands, yet others argue they reflect knowledge of distant lands observed by voyagers. If so, the possibility arises that pre-Columbian Asia had at least glimpses of the Americas, creating a record of exploration that has largely been lost to time. The cultural impact of potential Asian contact may also be found in art, religion, and technology. Similarities in weaving patterns, metallurgical techniques, and ceremonial practices between Asia and the Americas have been noted by some scholars. While mainstream archaeology often attributes these to coincidence, the convergence of multiple hints, oral histories, artifacts, botanical evidence, and currents suggest the need for a broader, more open-minded investigation. If Asian mariners reached the Americas before Columbus, their voyages would have been transformative in ways that leave only subtle traces. They may have introduced new crops, knowledge of metallurgy, or spiritual ideas. They may have exchanged goods or established fleeting settlements, leaving memories preserved in the stories and myths of indigenous peoples. And even if no permanent colony survived, the fact of their arrival would challenge conventional narratives of discovery, emphasizing a world connected by human ambition and the mastery of the seas. The possibility of Asian contact also reframes history in a profound way. It suggests that exploration was not the exclusive domain of Europe, but a shared human endeavor, undertaken by multiple civilizations simultaneously. While Columbus is credited with discovering the New World for Europe, the Pacific may have already been traversed by mariners from Asia, leaving only faint traces in memory, myth, and material culture. Ultimately, the story of Asian mariners reminds us that oceans are not barriers but opportunities. Human ingenuity, courage, and curiosity have repeatedly overcome distances that seem insurmountable. The Pacific, vast and mysterious, may have been crossed long before the age of discovery. Its shores visited by sailors whose names have been lost, whose achievements were unrecorded, yet whose presence lingers faintly in the myths, artifacts, and legends of the New World. In contemplating these possibilities, a pattern emerges. Multiple civilizations, Norse, Celtic, Phoenician, Egyptian, West African, and Asian, each ventured into unknown seas, each left whispers of contact across oceans. The discovery of the Americas may not have been a single moment, but the culmination of centuries of exploration, courage, and human ingenuity. And as we piece together these disparate threads, we begin to glimpse a history far more complex, interconnected, and extraordinary than the story we have been taught. As we trace the threads of pre-Columbian voyages, from Norse explorers to Asian mariners, a pattern of tantalizing anomalies emerges, hinting that human contact with the Americas was far richer and more complex than conventional history admits. Across continents, scattered artifacts, enigmatic inscriptions, and mysterious objects challenge the neat boundaries of accepted chronology. Some of these finds are small and easily dismissed. Others are so extraordinary that they continue to provoke heated debate among historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts alike. Together, they form a shadow history, a network of evidence that demands closer scrutiny. One of the most famous of these anomalies is the so-called Kensington runestone, discovered in Minnesota in the late 19th century. Inscribed with runes, it allegedly describes a Norse expedition reaching deep into the interior of North America, far beyond the coastal settlements at L'Anse-aux Meadows. Skeptics argue that it is a hoax, yet linguistic analyses and the context of discovery have led some scholars to entertain the possibility that it preserves a genuine memory of early exploration. If authentic, the stone represents not just a physical trace, but a bridge between myth and reality, hinting at journeys that mainstream narratives refuse to acknowledge. Equally enigmatic are the reports of ancient coins, tools, and metallic objects found in locations that appear to defy chronology. Phoenician and Carthaginian coins have allegedly surfaced in South and Central America, while Egyptian-style artifacts have been reported along the coasts of the Americas. Mainstream archaeologists typically dismiss these as misplacement, contamination, or modern forgery. Yet the sheer number of claims, spread across different regions, creates a puzzle that is difficult to ignore. Even if only a fraction are authentic, they point to contact between civilizations separated by oceans, contact that has been lost or erased from the official record. Stone inscriptions and carvings provide another layer of mystery. In places like Brazil, Mexico, and the southwestern United States, markings have been found that bear resemblance to Old World scripts, Phoenician, Celtic, or Norse. Critics argue that these are either natural formations or coincidental symbols, but the persistence of similar patterns across disparate regions suggests a deeper story. Could these carvings represent messages left by voyagers, warnings, or simply records of observation? If so, they offer tantalizing glimpses of a transoceanic network of contact long before Columbus. Botanical evidence further complicates the narrative. Plants native to the Americas, such as maize, potatoes, and coca, appear in parts of Africa, Asia, and even the Middle East before documented European contact. Conversely, Old World plants, like certain grains or legumes, appear in the Americas in pre-Columbian contexts. While some of this could result from natural dispersion or later trade, the patterns are intriguing. They suggest that goods, seeds, and perhaps even knowledge traveled across oceans, carried by voyagers whose journeys have left little else behind. Other artifacts hint at advanced skills or knowledge transferred across continents. Some metallurgical items found in the Americas resemble Old World techniques. Certain pottery styles, architectural forms, and artistic motifs appear strikingly similar to those from Africa, Europe, or Asia. Mainstream explanations often rely on coincidence or independent invention. Yet when viewed collectively, the anomaly suggests that early explorers may have exchanged ideas and practices, leaving subtle but enduring marks. Even the legends and myths of indigenous peoples hold traces of these encounters. Many Native American stories speak of pale or foreign visitors arriving in boats, bringing strange gifts, knowledge, or warnings. In the Great Lakes region, tales describe encounters with tall, bearded men who wore armor. Along the Pacific coast, myths recount pale-skinned strangers with unusual skills. While it is impossible to definitively prove these stories reference actual contact, the consistency of these narratives across time and geography is striking. Oral traditions, preserved for centuries, often encode memory in symbolic language, leaving clues for those willing to look closely. A particularly fascinating category of artifacts involves so-called out-of-place objects. These include carved stones, figurines, and tools that resemble Old World counterparts, yet appear in contexts that predate Columbus. While mainstream archaeology often rejects them as anachronistic, the anomalies persist. Each object challenges the notion of isolation, suggesting that human history is far more interconnected than conventional narratives allow. They are fragments of stories, faint echoes of voyages that remain largely invisible in the historical record. The significance of these anomalies extends beyond mere curiosity. They suggest a pattern of exploration, exchange, and human daring that spans centuries and civilizations. The Norse, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Celts, West Africans, and Asians may all have contributed to a hidden network of contact with the Americas, leaving behind artifacts, inscriptions, and stories that defy simple explanation. Each anomaly, taken alone, may seem trivial. Taken together, they form a web of evidence that demands a re-evaluation of pre-Columbian history. What is perhaps most striking is the persistence of these anomalies despite centuries of academic scrutiny. Scholars often dismiss them, yet new discoveries continue to emerge, challenging assumptions and inviting debate. The very act of dismissal suggests a tension between established historical narratives and the tantalizing evidence of hidden voyages. It raises questions about whose history is remembered, whose stories are told, and whose accomplishments are left unacknowledged. Ultimately, the mysterious artifacts and anomalies serve as a reminder that history is never complete. The material record is fragmentary, shaped by survival, accident, and the biases of those who preserve it. Yet the fragments that remain, runestones, coins, inscriptions, tools, plants, and oral traditions, offer glimpses of a richer, more complex story of human exploration. They hint at a world in which the oceans were crossed repeatedly by multiple civilizations, each leaving behind faint but persistent traces of their presence. In contemplating these mysteries, we are confronted with a fundamental truth. The discovery of the Americas was not a single moment in history, but the culmination of centuries of voyages, encounters, and exchanges. The artifacts and anomalies serve as signposts along this hidden journey, challenging us to question what we think we know about the past. They invite us to see history not as a linear narrative, but as a layered, interconnected web of human ambition, curiosity, and ingenuity. And perhaps, in the silent presence of these objects, there is a message from the past. It whispers that the world has always been more interconnected than we assume, that knowledge, skill, and daring can traverse vast distances, and that the story of human exploration is far richer and stranger than the official record reveals. The anomalies are fragments of a truth half hidden, waiting for those bold enough to follow the faint traces across oceans, continents, and centuries. Maps are the silent witnesses of human ambition. They are records not just of geography, but of imagination, observation, and the drive to understand the world. In the story of pre-Columbian voyages, ancient maps and lost charts provide one of the most tantalizing windows into what may have been. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, maps appear that suggest knowledge of lands and coastlines far beyond what conventional history credits these civilizations with knowing. Maps that hint at discoveries erased from memory or deliberately concealed. Among the most famous of these is the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. Drawn on a fragment of gazelle skin, the map depicts the coastlines of South America with astonishing accuracy, along with islands in the Atlantic. Some researchers argue that the map reflects knowledge derived from ancient sources, possibly Phoenician or Carthaginian. The detail in regions that Europeans would not officially explore for decades raises profound questions. How did this knowledge survive, and from whom was it transmitted? Equally enigmatic are maps, such as the Vinland map, purportedly showing Norse settlements in North America centuries before Columbus. Though its authenticity has been debated, the very notion of a pre-Columbian map depicting the New World challenges the conventional timeline of exploration. If genuine, It represents a direct line of evidence that someone, somewhere, had crossed the Atlantic and charted what they saw. Even if partially speculative, these maps are a reminder that knowledge can persist in unusual forms, hidden in ink, parchment, or the memory of explorers. Other maps, often overlooked, hint at contact from other civilizations. Certain medieval European charts depict islands and coastlines far to the west, sometimes labeled with names that do not correspond to known geography. Some scholars suggest these represent knowledge of the Atlantic gleaned from earlier mariners, Phoenicians, Egyptians, or even Chinese explorers. The consistency of these depictions across different cartographic traditions suggests that some real observation may underlie the apparent fantasy. Lost charts, destroyed libraries, and deliberately suppressed records add another layer to the mystery. The Carthaginians, for example, are known to have guarded their maritime knowledge zealously, and Rome's destruction of Carthage may have obliterated evidence of Atlantic voyages. Similarly, Chinese records of long-range maritime exploration were partially lost during the Ming dynasty's withdrawal from oceanic voyages, erasing centuries of navigational expertise. In such cases, maps and charts that survived, even in fragments, may preserve glimpses of a hidden history. The implications of these maps extend beyond simple geography. They suggest a transmission of knowledge across civilizations, linking Phoenicians, Norsemen, Asians, and perhaps others. Trade, exploration, and curiosity could have carried information from one culture to another, encoded in maps, sketches, or oral knowledge. The act of charting an unknown coast was itself an assertion of presence, a way of saying, "We have been here, we have seen this land." And even if the details were imperfect, the intention and the knowledge behind these maps speak to human ingenuity and daring. Consider also the strange accuracy of certain features. Some maps depict coastlines and islands that align closely with modern geography, despite being drawn centuries before systematic surveying. Others show details that correspond to areas now submerged or altered, hinting at observation of a landscape different from what exists today. Could these be remnants of real voyages, observations made by travelers who crossed oceans and returned, or by those who perished, leaving only cartographic traces behind? The mystery is compelling. Maps also reflect the tension between secrecy and revelation. Ancient civilizations understood the power of geographic knowledge. To reveal the location of distant lands could mean economic advantage, military risk, or the loss of prestige. Carthaginian, Phoenician, and even Egyptian navigators may have deliberately obscured routes and features to protect their interests. Maps, in this sense, become both records of discovery and instruments of control, containing truths that are only partially visible to modern eyes. The Ptolemaic maps of the Mediterranean and beyond provide another fascinating case. Claudius Ptolemy, the 2nd century Greek geographer, compiled knowledge from numerous sources, some of which are now lost. His maps depict lands that may correspond to unexplored regions, suggesting access to knowledge from voyagers whose names have vanished. Similarly, certain 15th century European portolan charts show Atlantic islands in positions difficult to reconcile with known discoveries, hinting at the survival of older navigational intelligence. Finally, the very survival of these maps is a story of chance and curiosity. Many were preserved in monasteries, private collections, or royal archives. Others were rediscovered centuries later, generating excitement and debate. Each map, fragment, or chart is a message from the past, a whisper of voyages that defy conventional history. They remind us that human exploration is not a single story, but a tapestry of journeys, observations, and records, some lost, some hidden, and some waiting to be interpreted. In contemplating these ancient maps and lost charts, we begin to understand the enormity of what may have occurred. The Atlantic, the Pacific, and the coasts of the Americas were not blank spaces awaiting Columbus. They were landscapes glimpsed, charted, and remembered by multiple civilizations over centuries. The maps we hold today may represent the faint echoes of those voyages, preserving fragments of knowledge that could reshape our understanding of pre-Columbian contact. Maps are more than mere tools. They're testimonies. Each line, each island, each notation represents observation, curiosity, and daring. They connect civilizations, hint at voyages lost to time, and suggest that the discovery of the Americas was not a singular event, but the culmination of centuries of human exploration. In these fragile sheets of parchment, we find the lingering traces of a hidden history, waiting for the modern observer to see beyond the lines, to glimpse the voyages that once were, and perhaps to imagine what else lies hidden just beyond the horizon. Beyond coins, inscriptions, and maps, the story of pre-Columbian voyages enters the realm of legend, prophecy, and esoteric knowledge, a shadowy domain where history blends with myth and the boundary between fact and belief becomes porous. Across cultures, whispers endure of travelers guided by visions, of prophecies, foretelling landfalls, and of secret knowledge encoded in sacred texts or oral traditions. These stories suggest that the discovery of distant lands was not always accidental, but sometimes the fulfillment of long-held expectations, a weaving of spiritual insight and human ambition. One striking example emerges from Celtic tradition. Legends speak of voyagers who crossed seas guided by the stars, but also by dreams and visions. St. Brendan's journey, though chronicled as a pilgrimage, contains elements that suggest esoteric guidance. Islands described with mystical symbolism, encounters with enormous sea creatures, and signs in the heavens that directed his path. Some scholars propose that such accounts encode practical navigational knowledge alongside spiritual allegory. The spiritual framing may have served as a mnemonic, ensuring that critical information about currents, winds, and safe harbors could be remembered and transmitted across generations. Similarly, in West African oral traditions, rulers and seers spoke of journeys into the unknown guided by divine insight. The story of Musa Abu Bakr too hints not just at ambition, but at a sense that the Atlantic voyage was a predetermined path, one aligned with cosmic knowledge or ancestral instruction. The decision to abdicate the throne and embark into the ocean may have been inspired not only by curiosity, but by a sense of destiny, a calling to explore beyond the familiar shores. Such narratives suggest that the drive to cross oceans often blended practical navigation with spiritual purpose, merging the material and mystical. In Egypt, esoteric symbolism intertwined with exploration. Certain hieroglyphs and temple carvings depict boats voyaging into the unknown, accompanied by stars, divine figures, or sacred symbols. Some theorists argue that these depictions were more than religious allegory. They may represent encoded knowledge of distant lands, navigational routes, or encounters that Egyptians recorded in symbolic form. By cloaking practical knowledge in spiritual imagery, these civilizations could protect secrets while passing essential wisdom to initiates. The line between prophecy and practical instruction, in this sense, becomes blurred. Across Asia, maritime journeys were often infused with spiritual significance. In Chinese and Japanese texts, voyages into the open ocean were sometimes described as fulfilling cosmic orders, encountering islands of legend, or obeying signs from heaven. Similarly, Polynesian navigation relied on a combination of empirical knowledge, stars, winds, waves, and cultural or spiritual instruction passed down through oral tradition. These systems demonstrate that esoteric knowledge was not mere superstition, but an advanced methodology that enabled precise navigation across vast distances, sometimes over thousands of miles of open water. Even among the Norse, legend and esotericism influenced voyages. The sagas describe lands west of Greenland with a mixture of realism and mystical elements. Certain journeys were guided by omens, dreams, and prophetic visions, often interpreted as the will of gods or spirits. While the Norse are remembered primarily as practical seafarers, these elements suggest that their decisions and routes were informed not only by observation, but by culturally sanctioned forms of intuition and guidance. In other words, their navigational acumen may have been inseparable from the mythic worldview in which they operated. The notion of prophecy guiding exploration raises profound questions about the interplay between knowledge, intuition, and ambition. Could some voyages have been deliberately undertaken because they were foretold, encoded in sacred traditions, or revealed to visionary leaders? If so, the act of discovery becomes not merely a physical achievement, but a fulfillment of cultural expectation, a convergence of human ingenuity and the unseen forces that guided belief systems across centuries. Esoteric knowledge also manifests in symbolic artifacts. Certain carvings, talismans, and ceremonial objects suggest an awareness of distant lands and the seas beyond. Among the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, navigational secrets were jealously guarded, often encoded in symbols or ritual instruction. By combining observation, mathematics, and symbolic knowledge, they could transmit essential information without revealing it to outsiders. The same principle may apply to other civilizations. Spiritual or mystical teachings could have concealed practical knowledge about navigation, currents, and distant shores, allowing exploration to proceed under a cloak of secrecy. Indigenous oral traditions in the Americas further reinforce the intersection of esotericism and pre-Columbian contact. Many tales describe arrivals of strangers who came from across the sea, bringing gifts, knowledge, or warnings. Some of these stories were preserved in metaphorical language, using spiritual or mystical motifs to describe what may have been literal encounters. Scholars of folklore note that myth often preserves historical events in symbolic form. What appears as allegory may, in fact, be memory encoded in a culturally coherent and spiritually resonant narrative. The role of esoteric knowledge also extends to timing. Many voyages appear to coincide with astronomical events, specific seasons, or other natural phenomena. Ancient mariners, whether in Egypt, Polynesia, or West Africa, understood that celestial patterns could guide navigation across vast and otherwise featureless oceans. Prophecy, ritual, and astronomy may have intersected, creating systems of knowledge that allowed voyages to succeed even when technology was limited. This convergence of mysticism and practical expertise illustrates that exploration was often as much a matter of intellect and cultural training as of physical endurance. Ultimately, legends, prophecies, and esoteric knowledge serve as a reminder that history is more than dates, battles, and political events. They suggest that the discovery of new lands often involved not only daring and skill, but imagination, spiritual insight, and the ability to read signs beyond the material world. For pre-Columbian voyages, this means that what may appear as myth today, visions, dreams, and prophecies, could have been integral to the success of exploration. When we assemble these threads, a pattern emerges. Voyages across the Atlantic and Pacific were not solely accidental, nor were they purely pragmatic. They were often motivated, informed, and guided by the intersection of human curiosity, ambition, and esoteric knowledge. From the Celts to the Egyptians, from West Africa to Asia, leaders and mariners acted with a sense of purpose that combined empirical observation with spiritual understanding, resulting in journeys that may have reshaped the world even before Columbus. In the shadows of these stories lies a larger truth. Human exploration has always been a synthesis of skill, courage, and imagination. The legends, prophecies, and secret teachings surrounding pre-Columbian voyages are not merely fanciful. They are windows into the mindset of civilizations that dared to traverse oceans, chart unknown lands, and leave traces of their presence. They remind us that the past is far richer and stranger than the linear histories we are taught to accept. By examining the esoteric alongside the tangible, we begin to appreciate that the story of discovery is not just a matter of geography, but of human consciousness. The visions, teachings, and encoded knowledge of these civilizations reveal a world in which the unknown was not feared, but sought, crossed, mapped, and sometimes immortalized in myth. In these intersections of mysticism and exploration, the pre-Columbian voyages come alive not only as physical journeys, but as profound human quests for understanding, meaning, and connection across oceans. By the time we reach the 15th century, a remarkable pattern emerges from the scattered fragments of history, legend, and artifact. Multiple civilizations had ventured across oceans, leaving traces that hint at a world more interconnected than traditional narratives allow. In this climactic chapter, we piece together these disparate threads, reconstructing a hidden tapestry of pre-Columbian contact, a web of daring voyages, cultural exchanges, and fleeting settlements that may have shaped the Americas long before Columbus set sail. Consider the evidence collectively: the Norse settlements at Lance aux Meadows, the Celtic legends of St. Brendan and Prince Madoc, the daring expeditions of West African rulers like Abu Bakr II, and the tantalizing hints of Asian mariners guided by Pacific currents. Each thread on its own is fascinating, yet isolated. Combined, they suggest a pattern that is extraordinary in scope. The Americas were not a blank canvas in 1492, but a landscape glimpsed, mapped, and sometimes visited repeatedly over centuries. This is the hidden history, the story suppressed, overlooked, or forgotten, waiting for careful reconstruction. The artifacts and anomalies discussed earlier, the Kensington runestone, Phoenician coins, enigmatic inscriptions, and unusual botanical distributions, provide physical clues that anchor these stories in reality. While individually these items might be dismissed, together they create a mosaic that is difficult to ignore. They point toward a recurring theme. Multiple cultures possess the knowledge, technology, and daring to reach distant shores, and they may have done so with purpose, not merely by accident. Ancient maps and lost charts lend further weight to this conclusion. The Pyrie Reis map, the Vinland map, and various medieval charts suggest that some knowledge of the Americas was transmitted across generations, sometimes deliberately hidden or encoded. These maps serve as evidence that early explorers may have charted lands, recorded observations, and returned, or at least communicated, information about distant continents. Knowledge of geography, currents, winds, and celestial navigation could have been preserved in ways that allowed subsequent generations to attempt similar voyages. Oral traditions and esoteric teachings also play a critical role in this puzzle. Legends of visionary guidance, prophecies, and mystical instruction suggest that voyages were often informed by spiritual frameworks, providing not only motivation but practical tools for navigating unknown waters. From Celtic dream-guided journeys to West African divinatory voyages, from Polynesian star-based navigation to Asian maritime prophecies, these narratives reveal that exploration was as much a mental and spiritual endeavor as it was a physical one. By connecting these threads, a picture emerges of a world where pre-Columbian contact was neither isolated nor accidental. Instead, it appears systematic, even if incomplete. The Norse may have established temporary settlements. Celtic or Welsh voyagers may have reached parts of Newfoundland or the eastern seaboard. West African fleets may have ventured into the Caribbean, and Asian mariners may have reached the western Pacific coast. Each contact may have been brief, its impact subtle. Yet together, they suggest a world in which human curiosity repeatedly breached the oceans long before 1492. The cumulative evidence also challenges Eurocentric narratives. History has often been framed around the achievements of European explorers, portraying the discovery of the Americas as a singular event. Yet the combined threads of Norse, Celtic, African, and Asian exploration suggest that the discovery of the New World was far more complex, the result of multiple civilizations testing the boundaries of their knowledge and daring to cross vast oceans. The narrative of Columbus becomes less a moment of absolute discovery and more a milestone within a continuum of exploration stretching back centuries. Climactically, the pattern is not merely chronological but geographical. The North Atlantic saw Norse and Celtic ventures. The South Atlantic may have hosted West African and Phoenician contact, The Pacific carried Asian mariners, and scattered across the Americas, anomalies, artifacts, and oral histories hint at fleeting encounters. Across oceans, continents, and centuries, these stories converge to reveal a surprisingly connected pre-Columbian world, a world of risk, ambition, and discovery that transcends the boundaries of modern historical imagination. In reconstructing this hidden history, the evidence suggests a series of parallel and sometimes overlapping explorations. These were not isolated accidents, but deliberate journeys influenced by ambition, necessity, spiritual guidance, and empirical knowledge. Trade networks, currents, winds, and celestial navigation all played roles, as did human imagination and courage. The oceans, often portrayed as barriers, become highways of human curiosity, linking continents and cultures in ways that challenge conventional understanding. Even more intriguing is the implication of cultural exchange. While the full extent is unknowable, it is possible that early visitors, whether Norse, Celtic, African, or Asian, shared crops, technology, and ideas with indigenous peoples. Such exchanges would have been subtle, leaving traces in agriculture, art, and myth rather than in large-scale settlements or monuments. In this sense, the impact of pre-Columbian voyages may have been more enduring than archaeology alone can reveal, encoded in the cultural memory and practices of the New World. The climactic realization is that history is not a linear story of singular achievements, but a tapestry woven from countless, often forgotten threads. Each voyager, each artifact, each legend contributes to a complex narrative of human ambition, ingenuity, and curiosity. Pre-Columbian contact is not just a historical footnote. It is a testament to the universality of exploration, the persistence of human curiosity, and the remarkable capacity of civilizations to reach beyond the known world. By synthesizing myths, maps, artifacts, oral traditions, and anomalies, a vision of pre-Columbian exploration emerges that is cinematic in scope, mysterious in detail, and profound in implication. It reveals a hidden network of explorers spanning centuries and continents, leaving traces of contact, guidance, and influence that ripple across time. The story challenges assumptions, invites wonder, and underscores the interconnectedness of human history, a history far richer and stranger than textbooks allow. In this climactic moment, the lesson is clear. The discovery of the Americas was not the work of a single sailor, a lone fleet, or a singular civilization. It was the culmination of centuries of human daring, of civilizations navigating the unknown, of myths blending with fact, and of knowledge transmitted through maps, artifacts, and stories. The tapestry of pre-Columbian contact is intricate, elusive, and profoundly human, a story of risk, ambition, and curiosity that resonates across oceans and centuries. And as we step back from this grand reconstruction, we are left with a lingering sense of wonder. The seas were crossed countless times before Columbus, by peoples now largely forgotten, their courage and ingenuity quietly shaping the course of history. Their voyages, preserved in myth, legend, and subtle traces, remind us that exploration is a timeless human endeavor, one that has always reached beyond horizons, challenged assumptions, and expanded the boundaries of what we believe to be possible. As we move beyond individual voyages and artifacts, a larger picture begins to emerge, a vision of the Atlantic and Pacific as interconnected crossroads of human exploration. Across millennia, currents, winds, and geography shaped the movement of people, goods, and ideas, creating pathways that civilizations could, and evidently did, navigate. By connecting the dots of pre-Columbian contact, we can begin to see a world in which the oceans were not barriers, but highways linking distant cultures in ways that challenge conventional historical narratives. The North Atlantic reveals the first threads. Norse expeditions from Greenland to Newfoundland, combined with Celtic legends of St. Brendan and Prince Madoc, suggest repeated crossings of northern waters. The skill required to navigate these seas, to survive storms, and to establish even temporary settlements is formidable. Yet the evidence points not to isolated incidents, but to a pattern. Explorers learning from experience, sharing knowledge, and gradually extending their reach farther west. The Atlantic was navigated with sophistication long before European powers attempted systematic colonization. Meanwhile, the South Atlantic presents a parallel story. The Mali Empire, under rulers like Abu Bakr II and possibly Phoenician voyagers centuries earlier, may have sent fleets across these waters, guided by currents and the prevailing winds. The Canary Current and the North Equatorial Current flow westward, naturally directing vessels from West Africa to the Caribbean and northern South America. This creates a plausible framework for deliberate transatlantic contact, suggesting that knowledge of oceanic navigation existed in multiple civilizations simultaneously. Turning to the Pacific, the currents reveal a different but equally compelling set of pathways. The Kuroshio Current, flowing from East Asia toward North America, along with the trade winds and island-hopping routes of Polynesia, created a natural highway across thousands of miles of open ocean. Mariners from China, Japan, and Southeast Asia could have used these currents, guided by stars, wind patterns, and a knowledge encoded in oral tradition, to reach the western coasts of the Americas. The evidence of crops like the sweet potato appearing in Polynesia centuries before European contact supports the idea that such crossings were not merely theoretical. By examining these routes collectively, a pattern emerges. Multiple civilizations, separated by geography and culture, may have independently reached the Americas through knowledge of natural oceanic pathways. These were not accidental journeys. They were guided by observation, skill, and in many cases, esoteric or culturally encoded knowledge. The evidence suggests that the oceans were repeatedly crossed, often leaving only subtle traces in artifacts, myths, and genetic or botanical exchanges. This convergence of evidence also highlights the interconnectedness of human ambition. Despite the vast distances separating West Africa, Northern Europe, and East Asia from the Americas, each civilization shared a common drive to explore the unknown, to push beyond familiar boundaries, and to seek new opportunities. The Atlantic and Pacific were arenas in which human ingenuity and courage were tested repeatedly, producing voyages that, while largely invisible in mainstream history, were no less extraordinary. The idea of these oceans as crossroads also reframes our understanding of contact itself. Rather than isolated events, Columbus' voyage in 1492 or the Norse settlement centuries earlier, pre-Columbian contact may have involved a series of fleeting, overlapping encounters. Indigenous peoples of the Americas may have witnessed strangers arriving sporadically from the north, south, and west, bringing knowledge, goods, or even seeds. These interactions could have been temporary, leaving few permanent settlements. Yet they left traces in stories, plants, and cultural motifs, subtly influencing societies long before sustained European colonization. Archaeological and botanical evidence further supports this concept of interconnected oceans. Crops, tools, and motifs found on distant continents suggest that goods and ideas traveled along these maritime highways. The distribution of the bottle gourd, the sweet potato, and other plants implies intentional or accidental transoceanic transfer. Similarly, certain artifacts, coins, inscriptions, and metal objects appear in contexts that defy simple explanation, hinting at a network of contact that spans oceans and centuries. The crossroads concept also illuminates the strategic intelligence of ancient navigators. By understanding currents, winds, and seasonal patterns, mariners could predict the best routes, avoid hazards, and ensure successful voyages. In some cases, these routes intersected. Norse ships sailing south along the Atlantic may have followed currents familiar to later West African explorers. Polynesian or Asian mariners may have reached islands already known to earlier travelers, integrating accumulated knowledge into new journeys. The result is a complex, multi-directional web of exploration. not a linear story of discovery. Moreover, the Atlantic and Pacific crossroads demonstrate that exploration was not merely a European phenomenon. Traditional narratives often emphasize European mastery of the seas, yet the evidence suggests that multiple civilizations were equally adept at navigating vast oceans, establishing temporary contact, and transmitting knowledge. This broader perspective challenges Eurocentric assumptions and underscores the universality of human curiosity and ingenuity. The oceans were crossed repeatedly by skillful mariners from disparate civilizations, each contributing to a hidden global story of discovery. Finally, this interconnected view of the oceans highlights the profound implications for understanding human history. Knowledge, culture, and technology may have flowed across oceans long before documented European contact, leaving subtle but meaningful imprints on societies around the world. Artifacts, myths, oral histories, and botanical evidence collectively suggest that the story of human exploration is far more intricate than a single voyage or civilization can capture. By connecting the dots of these diverse threads, we see a world in which pre-Columbian contact was not an anomaly, but a recurring phenomenon, shaping the Americas in ways that are still only partially understood. The Atlantic and Pacific crossroads remind us that history is not static. It is dynamic, interconnected, and often hidden beneath layers of omission and assumption. Each ocean, each current, each route traveled by ancient mariners represents a thread in a vast tapestry of human daring and curiosity. By tracing these pathways, we gain insight into the courage, skill, and vision required to venture into the unknown, and we begin to appreciate the profound complexity of the pre-Columbian world. In the end, the crossroads of the Atlantic and Pacific reveal a world waiting to be rediscovered. They remind us that the story of human exploration is not confined to European achievement, but encompasses the ingenuity of multiple civilizations across time and space. By connecting these threads, we glimpse a hidden history of contact, exchange, and ambition, an intricate web of voyages that redefines our understanding of the pre-Columbian Americas and invites us to imagine the courage and curiosity of those who first dared to cross the oceans. As we trace the voyages, maps, artifacts, and legends of pre-Columbian contact, a new question arises. What does all of this mean for the modern world? Beyond the thrill of mystery and the allure of forgotten mariners, the implications of these journeys extend into contemporary understanding of history, culture, and human potential. The recognition that multiple civilizations may have reached the Americas before Columbus challenges conventional narratives reshapes perceptions of technological and navigational achievement and invites us to reconsider the ways knowledge is preserved or lost over centuries. One of the most profound implications concerns the Eurocentric framing of history. For centuries, textbooks and academic discourse have emphasized the Age of Discovery as a uniquely European achievement, portraying explorers like Columbus, Magellan, and Cabot as pioneers in an otherwise uncharted world. Yet the evidence of Norse, Celtic, African, Asian, and Phoenician voyages suggests a far richer prehistory of exploration. If these civilizations reached the Americas first, then the narrative of discovery shifts dramatically. European explorers were not the first across the oceans, but rather part of a long continuum of human ambition and maritime skill. Recognizing this broader context transforms our understanding of global history, highlighting the accomplishments of civilizations often marginalized in mainstream accounts. The implications also touch on technology and navigation. The sophistication required to undertake transoceanic voyages, whether in the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, or across the Pacific, demonstrates that ancient and medieval civilizations possessed advanced understanding of currents, winds, shipbuilding, and celestial navigation. This challenges assumptions about technological progress, which often portray European innovation as uniquely pioneering. In fact, knowledge of the seas was cultivated across continents, transmitted orally, recorded in maps, encoded in sacred texts, and preserved through meticulous observation. Understanding pre-Columbian maritime capabilities encourages a more nuanced appreciation of human ingenuity throughout history. Cultural implications are equally significant. The possibility of contact prior to Columbus raises questions about early exchanges between distant civilizations and indigenous peoples of the Americas. Even fleeting interactions could have introduced crops, animals, tools, or artistic motifs, subtly influencing societies long before European colonization. For example, crops like the sweet potato in Polynesia, the bottle gourd in Africa and the Americas, and maize in unexpected regions hint at transoceanic exchange. Artifacts resembling Old World techniques found in the Americas may reflect knowledge transfer rather than coincidence. Such evidence encourages a reassessment of cultural diffusion, demonstrating that human history is interconnected in ways that transcend geographic barriers. The study of pre-Columbian contact also illuminates the fragility of knowledge. Many records, maps, and oral traditions were lost, destroyed, or deliberately suppressed over centuries. The Carthaginian and Phoenician archives vanished after the destruction of Carthage. Ming Dynasty China curtailed maritime exploration and destroyed records. European colonization often obliterated indigenous narratives. These losses underscore the contingency of history. What survives is often accidental, leaving fragments that must be interpreted carefully. Each artifact, legend, or map that endures is a window into a wider network of human experience that might otherwise have been forgotten. Modern implications extend even into identity and cultural pride. Recognizing that African, Asian, Celtic, or other civilizations reached the Americas before European colonization challenges narratives of marginalization and fosters a sense of global connectivity. It highlights the achievements of societies traditionally excluded from the dominant historical discourse, restoring their place as active participants in the history of exploration and discovery. This perspective not only enriches our understanding of the past, but also resonates with contemporary conversations about representation, recognition, and historical justice. There are also profound philosophical implications. The hidden history of pre-Columbian voyages emphasizes the universality of human curiosity, courage, and ingenuity. Across oceans, continents, and centuries, people have consistently sought to push beyond the known, to test the limits of their knowledge, and to explore the unknown. These stories remind us that exploration is a fundamental human trait, not limited by culture, geography, or era. In celebrating these voyages, we honor a shared human impulse that continues to drive discovery today, from deep-sea exploration to space travel. Moreover, modern scholarship itself is influenced by the lessons of pre-Columbian contact. The anomalies, maps, and oral traditions demand interdisciplinary approaches, combining archaeology, anthropology, history, linguistics, botany, and even climatology. Understanding these voyages requires an openness to evidence that spans material, oral, and symbolic forms. Scholars are increasingly recognizing that history is not a single, linear narrative, but a tapestry woven from multiple perspectives. This approach encourages humility in interpretation, inviting us to question assumptions and consider that the past may be more complex than textbooks suggest. Technology and digital tools amplify these insights today. Satellite imaging, radiocarbon dating, genetic studies, and oceanographic modeling allow modern researchers to test theories about pre-Columbian contact with unprecedented precision. These tools help identify potential ancient landing sites, track currents and trade winds, and detect subtle traces of cultural exchange that may have persisted for centuries. By applying modern science to historical questions, we can reconstruct the hidden voyages of mariners long forgotten, bridging the gap between legend and evidence. Finally, there is a narrative and philosophical lesson for contemporary society. The history of pre-Columbian contact illustrates how knowledge can be simultaneously fragile and resilient. Voyages disappear, maps are lost, stories fade, but fragments survive, often in unexpected ways, waiting for curious minds to piece them together. In this, there's a metaphor for human endeavor. Ambition, courage, and curiosity may leave faint traces, yet their impact can ripple across generations, influencing thought, culture, and discovery long after the original actors have vanished. The modern implications of this hidden history, therefore, are both practical and symbolic. They challenge assumptions, enrich understanding, and inspire curiosity. They remind us that the past is rarely as simple as it seems, and that human history is a dynamic interplay of exploration, exchange, and ingenuity. Most importantly, they invite us to remain open to evidence, to question received narratives, and to appreciate the extraordinary achievements of civilizations whose stories have been overlooked. In acknowledging the possibility of widespread pre-Columbian contact, we also reclaim a sense of wonder. The oceans, once thought to separate worlds, become bridges of human endeavor. The artifacts, maps, and oral traditions that survive remind us that discovery is never the product of a single culture or a single voyage. It is the sum of countless daring acts, imaginative leaps, and persistent inquiries across time and space. Ultimately, the modern lesson is clear. History is a conversation between past and present, shaped by what we preserve, what we investigate, and what we dare to imagine. Pre-Columbian voyages offer a profound opportunity to expand that conversation, to explore what has been hidden, and to recognize the universality of human curiosity. By embracing this perspective, we not only enrich our understanding of the Americas, but also honor the courage, skill, and vision of explorers from civilizations around the world. Voyagers who reached beyond the horizon, shaping the world in ways that continue to echo today. While the evidence for pre-Columbian voyages is compelling, a striking question arises. If multiple civilizations reached the Americas centuries before Columbus, why is this history so little known? The answer lies not only in the fragility of evidence, but in deliberate suppression, cultural bias, and the selective preservation of knowledge. Across time, human institutions, political, religious, and academic, have shaped the narratives of discovery, often marginalizing or erasing stories that did not align with dominant agendas. Understanding this suppression is key to piecing together the hidden history of early exploration. One of the earliest examples can be found in the Norse settlements of Greenland and Newfoundland. Though the sagas recount voyages to Vinland, these stories were largely relegated to myth in mainstream European consciousness. When Columbus sailed westward, Norse contact was either forgotten or dismissed as legend. The reasons are manifold. The Norse settlements were small, short-lived, and geographically remote, making their influence on subsequent European exploration minimal. Yet the erasure also reflects a broader trend. Histories that did not reinforce the dominant narratives of rising powers were often sidelined, quietly removed from public memory. In the case of African voyages, the story of Musa Abu Bakr II is equally revealing. West African exploration of the Atlantic, guided by fleets capable of transoceanic navigation, was largely ignored in European historical accounts. Eurocentric historiography prioritized European achievements while overlooking earlier accomplishments by African, Asian, or indigenous explorers. Records may have existed in oral traditions, in lost archives, or within societies that maintained secrecy to protect maritime knowledge. Regardless of intent, the result was the systematic invisibility of non-European explorers in global narratives. Maps and charts further illustrate the suppression of knowledge. Consider the Pyrie Reis map, which suggests familiarity with Atlantic coastline centuries before widespread European exploration. While it survived as a fragment, the broader knowledge it represents was likely kept secret or lost. Similarly, many ancient charts, especially those maintained by Carthaginians, Phoenicians, and other maritime powers, were deliberately withheld or destroyed, either to protect strategic advantage or through conquest and cultural upheaval. Knowledge of the world's oceans became concentrated in a few hands, and much of it disappeared before it could be integrated into historical memory. Religious and ideological factors also played a role. European expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries was often framed within a Christian worldview, emphasizing divine providence and the glory of European nations. Acknowledging that other civilizations had traversed the Atlantic, Pacific, or Caribbean centuries before could have challenged the theological and political justification for colonization. By portraying the discovery of the Americas as a uniquely European achievement, historical narratives reinforced authority, legitimacy, and national pride, while marginalizing prior achievements. In this sense, suppression was not merely accidental, it was ideological. The academic establishment, too, has contributed to the invisibility of pre-Columbian contact. Scholars often demand rigorous material proof, dismissing oral traditions, anomalies, and esoteric evidence as unreliable. While methodological rigor is essential, strict adherence to conventional standards can also obscure alternative interpretations. Artifacts like the Kensington runestone, strange inscriptions, or anomalous coins are often disregarded, yet they may contain kernels of truth. The insistence on linear, document-based history creates a form of intellectual suppression, where evidence outside accepted frameworks is marginalized rather than explored. Colonialism amplified this selective memory. European powers arriving in the Americas were invested in narratives that justified conquest, extraction, and cultural dominance. Pre-existing voyages, whether Norse, African, or Asian, offered no political advantage. Instead, they complicated the story of European primacy. As a result, knowledge of these earlier contacts was rarely preserved, and when fragments survived, they were often interpreted dismissively as myth, accident, or coincidence. Over time, this erasure solidified into conventional historical understanding, leaving the pre-Columbian voyagers almost entirely absent from mainstream consciousness. Even today, remnants of this suppression persist. Popular history often emphasizes Columbus as the discoverer of the Americas, while Norse, Celtic, African, and Asian contributions are relegated to footnotes, speculation, or fringe theory. Yet, digital technology, interdisciplinary research, and renewed interest in oral traditions and anomalous artifacts are challenging these entrenched narratives. Slowly, the suppressed histories of pre-Columbian contact are resurfacing, revealing a more nuanced, inclusive, and complex picture of human exploration. The suppression of these voyages also underscores the fragility of evidence. Many of the artifacts and records we rely on are incomplete, damaged, or isolated. Maps survive as fragments, oral traditions as altered echoes, and settlements leave scant material traces. When combined with deliberate suppression, it becomes clear why the broader historical record has largely forgotten these achievements. Yet even these fragments, when pieced together, illuminate a hidden history that is remarkable in scope and ambition. Intriguingly, suppression may not have been entirely intentional in all cases. Sometimes, the disappearance of knowledge results from natural disasters, climate changes, or societal collapse. The Norse settlements of Greenland, for example, were abandoned due to a combination of environmental shifts and economic pressures. African and Asian voyages may have ended in failure or been curtailed by changing political circumstances. Even when knowledge existed, its survival depended on continuity and documentation, both of which were fragile. Human history is full of knowledge lost, not to deliberate erasure, but to the vulnerability of civilization itself. Yet, despite suppression, traces persist, enough to reconstruct a tantalizingly incomplete narrative. Artifacts, maps, oral traditions, and legends collectively form a mosaic, hinting at what was possible. By examining these fragments carefully, historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts can recover glimpses of the voyages themselves, the routes taken, the cultures involved, and the risks endured. The suppressed history of pre-Columbian contact is not lost forever. It remains, waiting to be rediscovered, interpreted, and appreciated. Ultimately, the story of suppression illuminates a deeper truth. History is as much about what is forgotten or hidden as it is about what is recorded. The journeys of pre-Columbian mariners, Norse, Celtic, African, Asian, were remarkable in their own right, yet their erasure from dominant narratives reminds us that human memory is selective, influenced by power, ideology, and circumstance. By recovering these lost stories, we not only honor the explorers themselves, but also challenge ourselves to think critically about how history is constructed, preserved, and transmitted across generations. The suppressed history of these voyages is a testament to resilience, the resilience of knowledge, courage, and curiosity. Even when records were destroyed, myths were dismissed, and artifacts ignored, traces endured. These fragments allow us to reconstruct a hidden network of exploration, revealing that the discovery of the Americas was not the work of a single civilization, but the culmination of centuries of daring, skill, and imagination across multiple cultures. In studying suppression, we gain more than historical insight. We learn a lesson about human endeavor. That knowledge can be hidden, overlooked, or deliberately obscured, yet curiosity, perseverance, and critical inquiry can recover it. The story of pre-Columbian contact is a reminder that history is dynamic, incomplete, and often more complex than it appears. It invites us to question assumptions, examine anomalies, and consider what has been overlooked, both in the past and in our own understanding of the world today. As our journey through time, legend, and evidence draws to a close, the story of pre-Columbian voyages emerges as both astonishing and humbling. From the Norse reaching Newfoundland to the daring fleets of West Africa, from Celtic legends to the navigators of Asia and Polynesia, a pattern of exploration unfolds that challenges conventional history, expands our understanding of human ambition, and celebrates the universal impulse to push beyond the known. The legacy of these ancient voyagers is not measured only in settlements or artifacts, but in courage, curiosity, and the enduring traces of their passage across oceans. At its core, this hidden history reminds us that discovery is never the product of a single individual or civilization. The Americas were glimpsed, touched, and remembered long before Columbus sailed westward. Norse sagas tell of Vinland. Celtic myths describe visionary sea journeys. African chronicles hint at fleets traversing the Atlantic, and Asian maritime traditions speak of crossings guided by stars and currents. Each account adds depth and richness to a tapestry of exploration, suggesting that the world has always been connected in ways that transcend borders, languages, and epochs. Artifacts, maps, and oral traditions serve as tangible threads linking past and present. The Pyrie Reis map, the Vinland map, strange coins, inscriptions, and botanical traces are silent witnesses to voyages that defy conventional timelines. While some evidence remains fragmentary, collectively, it paints a compelling picture of global exploration long before European colonization. These objects are more than curiosities. They're the fingerprints of human endeavor, demonstrating that ambition, observation, and imagination have propelled civilizations across oceans for centuries. Equally important is the role of esoteric knowledge, prophecy, and legend. Across cultures, exploration was guided not only by wind and current, but by spiritual insight, dreams, and teachings encoded in myth. These elements underscore that the human drive to explore is as psychological and philosophical as it is physical. The ancients combined empirical observation with imagination, intuition, and ritual, creating a holistic approach to navigation and discovery that remains astonishing in its sophistication. The story of pre-Columbian contact also forces us to reconsider the narratives we accept about history. Eurocentric accounts, while valuable in many respects, have long obscured the contributions of non-European explorers. By acknowledging the voyages of the Norse, Africans, Celts, and Asians, we embrace a broader, more inclusive understanding of human achievement. This perspective does more than correct the record. It celebrates the universality of curiosity, courage, and a relentless desire to explore, reminding us that the drive to reach beyond the horizon belongs to all of humanity. Modern implications of this hidden history are profound. Understanding that oceans were crossed centuries before the age of discovery reshapes how we view technology, culture, and knowledge transfer. It challenges assumptions about the development of maritime skills and encourages interdisciplinary study, blending archaeology, anthropology, climatology, linguistics, and botany to reconstruct ancient networks. It also inspires a renewed appreciation for oral traditions, myths, and anomalies as legitimate sources of insight, reminders that history is often encoded in forms beyond written documentation. The legacy of these ancient voyagers is, in many ways, philosophical. Their stories teach resilience in the face of the unknown, patience in navigating uncertainty, and ingenuity in solving practical challenges with limited tools. They remind us that knowledge is cumulative, fragile, and often transmitted in unexpected ways, whether through maps, symbols, or storytelling. Even when records were lost, imagination preserved the memory of exploration, allowing fragments of history to endure across centuries. At the same time, the hidden history of these voyages invites wonder. Imagining fleets sailing across the Atlantic guided by currents, wind, and stars, envisioning mariners confronting storms, unknown coasts, and mysterious islands, contemplating the courage required to leave familiar shores without certainty of return. These are narratives that speak to the core of human curiosity. They remind us that exploration is not simply a historical act, but a timeless human endeavor, one that continues to inspire scientific discovery, adventure, and creative imagination today. In reflecting on this legacy, it becomes clear that the story of pre-Columbian voyages is not just about the past. It is a living narrative, one that continues to influence how we perceive connection, innovation, and courage. These ancient mariners exemplify the ability to overcome uncertainty, to trust knowledge and intuition, and to navigate both literal and metaphorical uncharted waters. Their courage echoes in every modern expedition, whether mapping the ocean floor, climbing peaks, or venturing into space. The oceans, once thought to separate worlds, are revealed as bridges linking civilizations across time. The voyages of the Norse, Celts, Africans, and Asians suggest that human history is interconnected, woven together by ambition, skill, and curiosity. This realization encourages humility and awe, reminding us that the past is not static, that discovery is not linear, and that the stories we tell are shaped as much by what has been hidden as by what has been recorded. As we conclude this exploration, the ultimate lesson of pre-Columbian voyages is clear. Human curiosity transcends boundaries, cultures, and centuries. The ancients dared to cross vast oceans, to chart unknown lands, and to leave traces that, though often hidden, survive as testimony to courage, ingenuity, and imagination. They challenge us to see history not as a single narrative dominated by a few, but as a complex web of interaction, experimentation, and daring that belongs to all of humanity. In honoring the legacy of these ancient voyagers, we celebrate the universality of exploration. We acknowledge the risks they took, the knowledge they preserved, and the mysteries they left behind. Their journeys remind us that discovery is not a destination, but a process, an ongoing pursuit that continues in each generation. Across every ocean and into every frontier of human understanding. The story of pre-Columbian contact is thus both an ending and a beginning, a conclusion to centuries of hidden voyages and an invitation to imagine, explore, and uncover what else lies beyond the horizon. The echoes of these voyages linger in the maps, myths, artifacts, and stories that survive, challenging us to look closer, question assumptions, and embrace the unknown with the same courage that inspired mariners centuries ago. As we reflect on the immense scope of human daring, we are reminded that the world is never truly discovered in a final sense. It is continuously revealed, shaped by those who are willing to venture beyond what is known, guided by curiosity, courage, and imagination. In the end, the legacy of ancient voyagers is a call to wonder, a testament to human audacity, and a reminder that the world is far larger, stranger, and more interconnected than history books often reveal. Their journeys are a mirror reflecting the enduring spirit of exploration, inviting us to follow in their wake, not just across oceans, but into the vast, uncharted territories of knowledge, imagination, and understanding.